and welcome back to Exhibit Extras, where we take you behind the scenes and give you an in-depth look at our exhibits and our exhibit making process. So as you can see here, we are standing in an empty exhibit space. We have successfully taken down our transportation exhibit, and we are now in the process of getting our next exhibit together. So today we're going to look at how this space is going to be used. So we're going to focus again on this large display case and this easel label behind me. And we're going to look at how an exhibit goes from concept to implementation. So what that process looks like. We're also going to talk a little bit about what constitutes a historic artifact that you might find on display in an exhibit. So let's start with what the exhibit is going to be. So our next exhibit is going to be on the Chester Inn Museum itself to commemorate the 10-year anniversary of the museum being here. So the first part of the exhibit, so this exhibit is conceived in a couple of parts. The first part is going to look at the museum itself, how the museum got here, so museum planning, how did it come together, what were the goals, that sort of thing. And so this part, this area that we're in is going to look at that portion of the exhibit. So to do that, there are a few items that we're going to look at to make sure that are going to be included here in this area. The first is a floor plan. Now, this is basically like a little poster, but this is from Natural Concepts, the company that helped lay out the exhibit. So this is just a floor plan. Not much has changed. The basic layout and structure is here. There are a couple of things that are included on this that did not make the final cut, including a section on presidential visits and a panel on the Watauga Road. Now, a couple of things that are missing include the timeline, which would be in the presidential visit area, and the mural of the town, which would be over here in this section with the Watauga Road in the state of Franklin. But this was from June 5th of 2008, so a few years before the museum actually opens. But this portion of the design phase, you can see the same basic structure and layouts here, but there are still going to be changes along the way. So as you can see on this, again, a lot of the same basic format and structures here. The mural is included. The interactive section is included with this layout. But one thing that does not make the cut that is seen here is the carriage. So there is a large interactive stagecoach or carriage from the 19th century that visitors would be able to climb into to get the feel of what it would be like to be in a 19th century carriage. So that tells us that the 1800s are going to be a pretty big area of focus for the museum. But again, even here, this is a couple months later. This is August of 2008. Some of these things were still, some of these major details are still being ironed out, and some of them will not make the cut. But from looking at these visuals, you can see that there is a lot of similarity to what the final product was actually going to be. Now, last thing I wanted to show you real quickly are, again, artist sketches or views about what the museum might look like with visitors in it. So you get, again, more visual construct of the planning side of the museum. This includes the carriage, so there's an artist rendering of the carriage of visitors, that sort of thing. But it also shows the pictures on the windows. So some of the major concepts are included here. Some, again, make it and some do not. But this is a good time to bring up if this is even a historic artifact. Some people might look at this, it's fairly recent, not even 15 years old, but it is kind of useful to look at because we don't do things the way we did 15 years ago. Even something like museum designing has changed quite a bit. We've got these images and things that we can look at, but they can tell us what it looked like to put a museum together. It also tells us what they were valuing as important pieces of history to include in the museum. So it's a little bit of a historiography of Jonesboro as well, just by going through these images. Now for me, they're going to be helpful because, if you remember in the last video, we talked about how the space is broken up into, it's not just one fluid space. So if this is going to be an exhibit that's in multiple parts of the floor, how do we connect it? And one of the ways that we can connect it are with images like this, or the pedestal case. So if you come to this portion of the exhibit, then walk between here and the other part of the museum floor where the rest of the exhibit is going to be, then if you see a pedestal case with a couple of items, and then you see one or two of these images spaced throughout, then it reminds you that you are actually in sort of one large exhibit. So it does help tie things together. But now we're going to go to actually piecing this exhibit together by filling out the space that is right here with us. So this is actually going to be the easiest portion. All we have to do is put something on this easel here. We've got the easel centered. We fixed the lighting according to what is here. So for example, when we had two pedestal cases here, we actually had two track lights here, and we had them shown down so you could see each of those. Since we've moved the two pedestals, we actually moved one of the lights to another portion of the museum to help with lighting in that area. So we just have one of these. But we're going to go with the floor plan as our first item. So we're going to put that over here. And again, the biggest reason for that is purely aesthetic. Museum design oftentimes includes something as basic as what's aesthetically pleasing and what's aesthetically viable. So this fits in this space, it fits pretty easily. It also, with this sort of item, it would look kind of awkward in a case, so it gives it a chance to sort of stick out. Also, it gives us a chance, just with this type of image with an easel, we've totally changed the space that was here in your last exhibit. So something little like this can actually help transform at least part of your museum space pretty dramatically. But let's now turn to the case, which is going to be a little bit harder to fill out. Alright, so now we've got our case here. The first thing that I want to do is find a spot for this. Alright, this is a big item, it's going to take up a large chunk of space. And so I'm going to slide this in here and try to put it in a spot where it's a little bit visually dynamic, a little bit visually interesting, and then sort of go from there. And so one thing I like to do whenever I'm putting exhibits together, so with this case, I don't have my acrylic pieces yet, so I don't have the things that I'm going to put out yet. So the first step for me is, okay, sectioning things off. What's going to go where, and how's it going to look, and then I'll try to build it up and actually create the exhibit. Alright, so I know for sure we've got this. I also want to include a brochure of the museum that we still actually use, which again is questionable if this is a historic artifact or not, but it's useful for us because it gives us a nice visual for like the final development of the museum. So I definitely want to include that. I also want to talk about the logo that's used for the museum. So we've got a copy of the logo, which is a drawing that was done by local artist George Dukes. So I want to include the logo, and I have a couple pictures of George Dukes to include as well. And this is, so again, when you're talking about what you want in a case and what you want in an exhibit, you do want variety as much as possible. So just a bunch of poster board is not really going to be that dynamic of an exhibit. If we can break that up by dividing and spreading the posters out, and then including photographs, and then mixing that with other types of visual ephemera like a brochure. And then also I want to include newspaper articles. So we have a couple of newspaper articles about the process of putting this museum together. So one from 1987, where the NAPS organization was approved to run the Chester Inn, and then sort of lay the groundwork for, that's 87, 88, that's right in the preservation period when that process starts. So this is sort of like the origin of the museum portion of the exhibit. And we have an article from the Johnson City Press in 1989 that includes the process of actually restoring the inn back to its historic appearance. So this is a really good example because, or this would be a good artifact to use because it ties directly into that process, the planning process. This is not planning for the museum, but this is planning for the preservation of the building, which lays the groundwork for the museum to come in later. So just trying to visually conceive of what this is going to look like, you don't want your space in an exhibit to be too cluttered. They can't be too spare either, so you have to kind of walk a fine line. So this provides us a great starting point of a large item. And then we also have another kind of large newspaper that we can put up, and then a small newspaper to break it up. So we also have, between the two photographs of George Dukes and the drawing of the museum, or of the Chester Inn, we have a George Dukes section as well. And now it's just trying to figure out which section is going to go where and how that's going to be displayed. Alright, so I've gone to get my acrylic display pieces to actually start assembling the exhibit. I've already made a change. I've already moved this item from the top shelf to here. Again, aesthetics are part of it, but also if this is going to be looking at a story about how the museum got here, even though this is not the final version of the museum, it is the newest of the items that we're going to be working with. So if we're telling a quick story about how the building got designated as a spot for the museum and how it got preserved in the first place, that's actually an earlier part of the story. So we're going to go from sort of sequentially from that process to here and end up here. So we're going to start assembling this stuff and see what we can come up with. Alright, so we've got the case together. A couple things to point out. It's kind of, even though it's one big case, it is kind of sectioned off. So we have items here on the origins of the preservation of the building. Down here we have stuff on the museum. So we've got George Dukes section here, and then we've got these items from the museum planning, and then the final brochure. A couple of things to point out. There is some blank space here. One thing, again, as you're putting the exhibit together, especially if you do this for a while, you kind of have an idea about what your labels are going to look like. So, you know, I have just put this stuff out there, but I have been thinking about this exhibit for a while. I've been planning, I've been getting items together, I've been thinking about what's going to go where. So this is one of the final portions of the phases. I should put stuff out here. A lot of planning has gone into this already. And even now the plan is a little fluid and can be flexible. But there what I'm going to do is probably have one large label that sort of describes the stuff that's here. And then down here there's space for a couple of small labels to talk about, to just identify like what this is. And then a little section on George Dukes. So there's a spot for a label here, there's a spot for a label here if I want to include one there as well. Also, again, this is kind of a big open space. There's enough area to have at least one or two pictures from the museum's grand opening, which we still have on our computer down here at the museum. We have pictures from when the museum opened, and that would be a great thing to include in the exhibit. And so if I include that, which I plan on trying to include at least one or two, this is probably the case that they're going to go into. So even though there is still some blank space here, there are going to be labels to fill that space, and even aside from that, there are other items and objects or photographs that can go into it to sort of help with the space. Alright, now the last thing I'm going to talk about are some other items that are going to be in the exhibit. So we've got items related to the museum, or not to the museum, but to the hotel specifically. So we've got some more recent items from when the building was used as apartment space and the town library. And we also have some historic bottles that were found that were attributed to being from the inn's earlier history. So those are going to go in our pedestal cases. Again, pedestal cases, small area to work with, 1 or 2 sort of exhibits to spotlight or items to spotlight, and those will go there to sort of help the transition from museum to the building and preservation, and then transition us to the next part of the exhibit. Also throughout in part of the exhibit is another item that I cherish. This is the state structures report for this building from when the inn was sort of in the process of being restored or about to be renovated for its first big preservation effort from the state. And so this lays out just a very detailed, structured report about the building itself and the condition it was in, what was here when it was initially restored. So I'm going to include this in the other part of the exhibit to show what the actual preservation of the building looked like. So you've got museum space, then you've got preservation space, and then you've got building history spaced throughout. Alright, so that concludes this episode of Exhibit Extras. Be sure to keep up with us as we continue to go through the museum planning portion, or the exhibit planning portion of our current exhibit, and keep an eye out for anything else that we have coming up. Be sure to follow along with us on Facebook and YouTube at the Chester Inn, and check out our next videos as they come out. Thank you.